Hello, everyone. Thank you to the approximately 100 participants who have registered to join us today for this expert roundtable on the impact of the Russian war in Ukraine on global food security. Today's event will be held in English and will have Ukrainian interpretation by our colleagues, Andriy and Sasha. Please select the language that is most appropriate for you at the bottom of the screen. My name is Milena Sterio, and I'm the Managing Director at the Public International Law and Policy Group, and also a chaired professor of law at Cleveland State University. I will be moderating today's discussion, and I'm honored to be guiding the conversation with my colleagues. The Public International Law and Policy Group is a global pro bono law firm providing free legal assistance to parties involved in peace negotiations, post-conflict constitutions, and atrocity crimes prosecution. This roundtable is part of PILPG's Thought Leadership Initiative, which aims to share expertise and reflections from our work by organizing periodic roundtables focused on prominent international law issues and pressing global conflicts. Today's expert roundtable is part of our Ukraine series, a series that aims to discuss recent developments relating to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. PILPG holds regular expert roundtables on Fridays from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Now for some quick background. On February 24th, 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which has thus far led to thousands of civilian deaths, extensive destruction of Ukrainian cities, massive displacement, and a growing food crisis in Ukraine. Russia's invasion has destroyed critical infrastructure and lands needed for agricultural production and exportation, and Russia's tactics have included the bombing of Ukrainian ports, blocking of exports, and the suspension of vital agricultural operations. Russia and Ukraine are key agricultural producers and among the most important suppliers of fertilizers in the global economy, and the recent invasion leaves the global market, as well as many low-income countries, vulnerable to soaring food and fuel prices. The World Food Program estimates that the number of severely food insecure people doubled from 135 million before the pandemic to 276 million at the start of 2022. And the war in Ukraine is expected to drive the number of food insecure people to approximately 323 million by the end of the year. During this event, our panelists will discuss the impact of Russia's war on global food security, lessons that the international community should take away from the crisis, and concrete policy considerations to examine in order to reduce global food insecurity moving forward. The roundtable will be 60 minutes long. Our distinguished panelists include Yvette Stevens, Andriy Martin, Mikhailo Malkov, and Igor Lukshich. Olga Shevchenko has unfortunately had urgent international negotiations to attend at the Polish border and could not join us today. Today's event will be recorded and subsequently posted on our website. We ask that you please submit any questions you have for our speakers using the Q&A function, and we will do our best to answer your questions throughout the event. Now, please allow me just a couple of moments to introduce our panelists. Joining us today is Mikhailo Malkov. He currently serves as the head of the Agricultural Committee of the Ukrainian Business and Trade Association. He's an internationally recognized expert on sustainable development, food systems, and the fight against illegal trade, with more than 20 years of experience in business and international organizations, including the United Nations and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. We're also honored to welcome Andriy Martin, a well-known specialist in land policy, land management, land valuation, licensing systems, and land law. He has more than 20 years of experience in the state and private sector. Andriy worked as Deputy Director for Technical Issues in the World Bank's Rural Land Titling and Cadastre Development Project for Europe. He graduated from the National Agrarian University and currently serves as a Senior Project Manager for Land Reform at the Reforms Delivery Office of the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine. Next, we have Ambassador Yvette Stevens. She has broad and long experience in the United Nations system. Ambassador Stevens has served as the United Nations High Commission for Refugees Deputy Liaison Representative in Ethiopia and representative to Kenya and Somalia. She served as the director in DESA, the United Nations Office of the Special Advisor on Africa. Before retirement, she was the United Nations Assistant Emergency Relief Coordinator and director of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Geneva. After retirement from the United Nations, Ambassador Stevens worked as an energy policy advisor to the government of Sierra Leone before being appointed as permanent representative of Sierra Leone in Geneva. She served as chair rapporteur of the Human Rights Council Expert Group on Prevention from 2019 to 2020 and is currently an executive in residence at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. And last but certainly not least, we have Prime Minister of Montenegro, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs and European Integration. He was also the Minister of Finance, member of the Parliament of Montenegro, and member of the Parliament of Serbia and Montenegro before that. Center and serving in several governmental positions, Igor was committed to political and economic freedoms and reforms based on rule of law and business-friendly environments. He holds a PhD in the economics of transition and is a professor at the University of Donja Gorica Podgorica. Dr. Lukšić is also a senior peace fellow with the PILPG. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for agreeing to participate in today's panel. Now, let's begin with the questions, and let's begin with the discussion with our distinguished experts. My first question is for Andriy. In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, provoking a global security crisis, which many anticipate will be similar to or worse than that faced in 2007 and 2008. One of the greatest impacts of this war has been on food security. Andriy, what military tactics has Russia used that disrupt the food supply chain?
Yes, Milena. So, Russian military tactics is not very original. It usually includes the shelling of Odessa and other coastal port cities of Ukraine. In the spring, actually, Russian Navy was at the distance which was made possible to attack cargo ships and create obstacles to international navigation. Everybody understands that we had more than 80% of our agricultural export through the seaports, so blocking of seaports was export supplies almost impossible. Also, a significant part of the water area in the western part of the Black Sea was mined to counter the landing of Russian troops. Dnipro River, the main transport artery of the Ukraine, also cannot fulfill its navigable functions to the Black Sea because of the last lock on the cascade of reservoirs is located in temporarily occupied territory. Russia still shelling Ukrainian seaports, Ukrainian cities. For example, the last shelling on September 4, Russian attacked Charkiv, and the grain elevator was destroyed. Rockets hit it, and we lost another few thousand tons of grain. Also, Russia strikes on bridges and railway infrastructure, and that's also significantly limit the ability to deliver grain to ports. But due to effective use of anti-ship weapons, Ukrainian military made it possible to dislodge Russian warships from the western part of the Black Sea, and especially the liberation of Zminy Island, as well as strikes on captured drilling platform that hosted Russian military personnel and weapons, played an important role in improving security in the Black Sea. And currently, after the Istanbul agreements, exports is taking place through the three ports, Odessa, Pivdeny, and Chornomorsk. But in the future, we hope it will be possible to expand them. And sure, all recommendations of the naval forces and armored forces must be followed for the providing exports. So we will hope that in the nearest months, the Ukrainian grain export will expand maybe up to 5 million tons per month. So we hope that it will give the ability to export this year yield and uh, actually grain which was received last year, but everything is still not in the too safe situation, because we understand that even if there is no Russian ships in the Western Black Sea right now, they still have a possibility to hit the
food, affordability of food, utilization and sustainability. And the war in Ukraine, of course, has the impact of all these four pillars. I would like probably to stop on availability and affordability. When it comes to availability of food, everybody knows that both Ukraine and Russian Federation are the sources of food, main sources for food, especially for commodities for various countries like Egypt, like Bangladesh, like Myanmar and Indonesia, and and quite a lot of others, sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, the disruption of supply chains has a significant impact on organization of managing the food security in these specific countries. So the food is, first of all, commodities are and value chains related to these commodities. Of course, they are facing significant problems with supplies, and of course that's why availability is under threat. But also affordability is also a huge issue, because the prices, because of availability, they are going up, but not only directly the prices of food, but we need to know that we need to understand that food security is seriously depending from the growth of energy prices. And the growth of energy prices, of course, contributed to the growth of food, and therefore the food is becoming not in many countries. The food is simply becoming not affordable. There are plenty of examples on that. Even despite the fact that the FAO food index is going a little bit down now, which is related to the strong dollar and to weak euro, still the prices are much higher than the prices in 1 year in comparison when was 1 year before. And finally, this is an immediate reaction of the markets to the war in Ukraine, but we'll certainly face the midterm impact, which will be caused by even after post-conflict, post-war situation, that will be caused mainly because of the terrible situation with natural resources in Ukraine. And we have significant soil contamination, water contamination. We have huge mining contamination of the nature of soils, and that we have plenty of problems. Unfortunately, there are plenty of problems with forests, which certainly will contribute to climate change. But it is another issue. But what we need to admit immediately is the cutting of all shelter belts. So this is a kind of belts located, which are protecting fields from the soil erosion. Most of them have been cut during the war because of, first of all, because of military issues, but also because of the lack of woods for heating in during the winter and springtime. that will contribute to significant soil erosion in the steppe areas in Ukraine, where the shellings were the most heaviest. So that will be another issue for global food security, bearing in mind the level of Ukrainian export, which Andrei has brilliantly mentioned, recently. And when it comes to the national level, I would probably contribute to what Andrei has mentioned already, saying that in accordance with the calculations recently released by the Department of State of the United States, 15.7% of all grain storage facilities have been damaged or demolished during the war in Ukraine. And there is also a statement, for example, that 15% done by the first deputy minister, of Agrarian Policy and Food, saying that 15% of entire animal farming is not existing in this country anymore, including damage of animals. And of course, the government is trying to address this issue, to address the food security, of course, on national level, working on different layers, starting from food distribution to the most vulnerable groups, but also providing support to the farmers, and certainly contributing to improve the logistics, improve the situation with grain storage, together with FAO, and the government has developed a program financed by various countries like Canada, Japan, Germany, the United States of America, in order to establish a temporary storage, grain storage for this year's crops. Improvements of logistics, including the logistics not only through the grain deal, but also through the western border and through river, is also on the agenda. So all that sort of things, all these measures are, to my understanding, illustrating that the government of Ukraine has a strong will to fulfill its obligations as one of the guarantors, and food security as one of the food baskets placed in the Black Sea. Over.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive answer. My next question is for Ambassador Stevens, and it has to do with the effect of the global security crisis as provoked by Russia's invasion of Ukraine on developing countries. There are countries in the Middle East and Africa that significantly depend on Russian and Ukrainian imports. How is the crisis affecting these countries?
First of all, thank you, and thank you for including me in this discussion. Now, I want to start by putting things in context, because we all know that even before the war, we had a lot of strain on food. We were having a lot of strain on food production. The climate change has had its toll, and also so has COVID-19. The war in Ukraine served to exacerbate the situation. Before the war, global food security situation was already fragile due to inappropriate agricultural policies, climate change. The Horn of Africa was facing the worst drought in 4 decades. And according to FAO, 786 million people were chronically hungry, and 193 million facing crisis level of acute food insecurity. So it is within this context that the war in Ukraine happened. And as has been already said, both Ukraine and Russia are responsible for a substantial amount of grains, particularly grain supplies to many countries. And according to the European Commission's Knowledge Center for Global Food and Nutrition Security, they classified 3 groups of countries that would be affected. And the first ones are the countries that are highly dependent on grain imports from the Black Sea. The disruption of the supply chain has immediate implications. For instance, Lebanon depended on 54% of its import of wheat and flour from Ukraine, Tunisia 49%, Libya 47%, Pakistan 43%, Indonesia 27%. It's also estimated that countries dependent on Russia grains, 30 countries depend on Russia-Ukraine imports for 50% or more of their wheat supply. Several of these are least developed countries and low-income food deficit countries. So the war in Ukraine is having an immediate impact on these countries because it has limited their food supplies, and somewhere in the future we'll have to see how much that has impacted on hunger. But there you go, that these countries are immediately, the effect of them is immediate. There are also countries that rely on imported grains and vegetable oil to cover dietary needs. The soaring grain prices, which will also affect their food security. And in this connection, I have to say that the economic sanctions and decision by Russia and Belarus to suspend export of fertilizers is having a profound effect on these countries, on the production. So all countries will be affected by global food prices, inflation, locally produced or imported, due to the soaring energy, and I think it was mentioned, and the fertilizer prices. In terms of the manufacture of fertilizers, a lot of which comes from Russia and Belarus, and the high price, the decision, as I said, would also help to reduce use of fertilizer and also reduce yields in all countries that are also producing foods. The higher food prices also compromise WFP's, the World Food Programme's, ability to supply food to the areas of great need. Another impact of the implication of the problem in terms of food security is the economic activities in Russia. Weakening of the ruble will reduce the remittances to Central African countries like Kyrgyz Republic and Tajikistan. FAO predicts undernourished people will increase from 8 to 30 million in 2022-2023, most pronounced in Asia, Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Near East and North Africa. Then also another thing we have to see is the implication in terms of the implication on foods of the war, is that fragile countries like Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen would also suffer because of the risk, that the access to food is jeopardized by the war in Ukraine. For poorer countries, increased prices of grain could lead to removal of subsidies and rising prices, and this has the potential to lead to social unrest in some of the poorest countries. We are beginning to see signs of this in some countries. Then another, and I would stop after this. Another impact that I find is on poor countries is the possible reduction of ODA as a result of the financial support to Ukraine. I think we should also bear this in mind, because again, when we come to look at what needs to be done to ensure food security in some of the poor countries, we would realize that a decrease in assistance to these countries will also impact on food security. So I stop at that point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My next question is for Mikhail. So what is the Ukrainian government doing to address food insecurity in Ukraine and perhaps this larger issue of global food insecurity? What are some current approaches by the Ukrainian government?
Yeah, I've started replying this question actually first. We have started already speaking about the grain deal, and there, as you know, the grain deal is an effective instrument, and there are certain discussions now. The discussions now with regards to the continuation of the grain deal are ongoing. As far as I know, they are not easy discussions, and mainly caused by the position of Russian Federation. These talks are really not easy, and therefore the government understands, in my view, that the worst scenario may happen. Therefore, they certainly understand the importance of grain storage, and therefore they are organizing this grain storage strategy of storing more than 6 million plus 7.5 million tons of storing of grain for the next for the harvest of this year. And meanwhile, the government is also working with addressing the issue of logistics, of new developments of the new logistic chains, supply chains through the western border by rail, by organizing the solidarity rails lanes conference in Prague, and trying to prolong the Ukraine, Soviet-style railways to the direction of Europe by trucks. Of course, unfortunately, as of today, there are in about 15 kilometers queue to the checkpoints, and we even despite the fact that Ukraine and the European Union have signed the preliminary agreements on simplification of customs procedures, it doesn't cover the procedures related to the veterinary goods, and the traces system is not in place in Ukraine. Although some talks are, and that slows down a little bit the processes related to the export of for example, of poultry from Ukraine to European Union and to the other countries. Meanwhile, of course, Ukraine is providing support to when it comes to the national level. The government of Ukraine is together with the international organizations like WFP, first of all, is providing the food distribution in the most affected areas, especially in the gray zone, and they are providing support to the small-scale farmers by grants, by credit rates. So all these instruments are in place, and the government is really keeping an eye on the agricultural sector, which nowadays is becoming one of the, I would say, one of the drivers of the Ukrainian economy. Last but not least, we have a significant deficit in fisheries, because probably you're aware of the Sea of Azov, which contributed to the major share of Ukrainian sea fish nowadays is completely occupied, while the major inland fisheries, fishery reservoirs suitable for fisheries, they are not operational because of the military actions and martial law inside the country, but also heavy shellings in the area of the river of Dnieper. Therefore, the government is really trying to focus on the development of aquaculture inside the country. Black Sea is also mainly paralyzed because of the mining of the coastal area. So there is a huge deficit, which is covered mainly by import of which government is supporting, but also by development of the aquaculture. So there is a comprehensive response from the government, both on national level and international level, which is not an easy job, unfortunately.
Thank you. Now, Igor has been patiently waiting for his turn. Let me go to you next. How has the international community reacted to this crisis? What have some national governments done so far? And what kinds of policy plans might other national governments have? And then what do you think should be the role of international organizations such as the United Nations in this crisis?
Thank you very much for this group of questions, Milena. First of all, let me thank you for the possibility to join this very interesting panel on food security. And when a war breaks out, normally people's minds go immediately to the suffering, immediate destruction, and anything related to that. But very soon afterwards, we start to realize all the impact. In this case, obviously, the global impact of this war has been huge and probably continuing, as we've heard from distinguished colleague panelists. Even if even if war stopped today, it doesn't mean that we are back to normal. It will take a while before we get back to normal. And immediate questions are, what about the next agricultural season? What is the long-term impact? Are we going to be able to respond to growing needs? And as Ambassador Stevens was talking about, putting this whole thing into the context of, before the war, we already had the dire situation when it comes to the food insecurity. And you, Milena, in your introductory remarks also mentioned the tendency of seeing more and more people being exposed to food insecurity. There's been a paradox situation in which donors, international organizations have had to endure a moral dilemma of whether to cooperate with Al-Shabaab, horrible terrorist organization, in trying to figure out ways how to reach endangered people in Somalia, for example. So there are examples like that. Knowing that Russia and Ukraine combined supply 30% of the wheat, global wheat, 20% of corn, or 70, 80% of sunflower oil, it immediately starts to sound like a panic call, because just like with COVID-19 when it was on the peak, just like with, unfortunately, the climate change impact, we have seen, or the whole situation has revealed a lot of global systems vulnerabilities. In this case, when it comes to the food insecurity. And when you ask, could international community do more? In the wake of the immediate breaking out of the war, probably not. Yes, UNAGA has called for the keeping of agricultural channels operational through the resolution called the State of Global Food Security. The United States has led efforts together with 102 countries to sign up for a global roadmap for global food security. USAID has stepped up efforts to ameliorate the situation together with World Food Program. So these are all commendable actions, but it also reveals that we probably need additional action, and we cannot simply rely on the success of the Turkish diplomacy together with UN to broker a grain deal, to discuss the possibility of extending a grain deal and so on. So probably we need something more tangible. And the only thing that comes to my mind, honestly, is something like a global reserve food fund. I believe that there is a lot of seasoned experts, experienced people who combine different expertise within the UN system, but also partner organizations, World Trade Organization, World Food Program, FAO, who could, hopefully design something that might serve as a global network of global reserve food fund. We at the national level, many countries do stockpile, and many countries have their own reserve funds to use at some in some acute situations. But the fact that 10% of the world population has been chronically hungry, and more than 300 million of the people will endure severe lack of food, I think we need to step up efforts to try to figure out if there is something more that we could do, and something which obviously will not rely only upon public funding. We need to be able to think creatively. Agricultural markets everywhere are pretty distorted. There are a lot of subsidies, different incentives. Tricky thing about grains, grain production, is that it is not that all that is spent by or consumed by humans. It is, a lot of it is obviously used for cattle feed, but a lot of it is used for production of biofuels. So there are different different distortions within the global system. The whole crisis reveals a lot of those vulnerabilities. Therefore, I believe we need to be able to step up efforts and come to something which is more tangible than only responding, then only first respondents activity after an emergency breaks out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me go back to Mikhail. Mikhail, have we seen war impact global food security at this level in the past? Or do you think that this is a new issue or a relatively new issue prompted by increasingly interconnected global supply chains?
Well, I'm trying to make the brief analysis. At least in the near past, I couldn't remember any sort of military conflict or war which has such significant impacts on the global food security and the global supply chains. Firstly, not because if you look at this from the point of view of food systems, if we understand that food security significantly depends from the energy, if like Igor has mentioned already, parts of the crops have been used for the production of biofuels, and we have the COVID crisis before. We have the climate change, which unfortunately exists, and at least in Ukraine, climate is favorable for crop production this year, but in most parts of Ukraine, but still, situation is not easy. I would say that it is absolutely unprecedented crisis, and the cumulative effect of this crisis, everybody can feel. In all parts of the world. Look about the situation with the coal, which is much far from the food markets. However, it is also the impact of the crisis. The energy prices are growing, and there is no gas, and the gas is sky high, and of course, fertilizers prices are sky high, and the farmers even in Latin America can feel it, and it is unprecedented crisis. And but again, it is first of all, it is because of the fact that the supply chains are absolutely interconnected, but secondly is because of the fact that climate, that this crisis is coupled with the other crises like climate crisis, and by the way, and the war is, of course, is contributing to the climate crisis, at least to the growth in emissions, and it is coupled also by COVID, which unfortunately is still ongoing.
Thank you. My next question is for Ambassador Stevens, and it has to do with prevention. So is there something that the international community, international organizations, as well as states can do to prevent such a food crisis in the future? How might this crisis affect policy discussions in the future? You're on mute, Ambassador Stevens.
Given me the opportunity to put on my prevention hat. And the one thing that I wanted to say under this is that the international community needs to do a lot more in terms of preventing conflicts. And I am not altogether convinced that through negotiations and through whatever, that we could not have prevented some of these things that we are seeing now. So basically, I believe that the emphasis on prevention, the international community should not only pay lip service to the question of prevention, but act on it. And also, if you ask me what the international community needs to do next, I would say that might sound naive. I would say try to end the war. Because let us face it, now we are talking about the effects on food security, but with the ongoing conflict and the destruction of agricultural facilities within Ukraine, it's going to get worse. It can only get worse because by next year, we will not have the production that is required to meet with even if the ports were open. I mean, if the war continues, nobody knows how far this is going to get. So I think, though it might seem naive, but I think somehow this war has to end. Now, in the long term, I would say that the lesson that we're learning now is that there's a lot, it exposes again the failure of some countries to invest in agriculture. And I would say this for instance, Africa has 60% of agricultural land that is unutilized, uncultivated agricultural land. 60% is in Africa, but only 6% of agricultural land in Africa is irrigated. So what I'm saying is the whole policy towards food security has to be geared such that countries are to be able to use what they have in terms of agricultural land to support themselves more. So that I think is something that we would need to. It's something that existed, and there's a lot of lip service again towards saying that countries should now produce, should be self-reliant. But when you look at countries depending on imports of their major staple food, especially some countries in Africa, including mine, I have problems with that. Because we know in the 60s, for instance, Sierra Leone was exporting rice, but now we are importing most of our use of rice. We need to look inwards and see how we can, with the assistance of the international community, help to be more self-reliant on food production. And also, of course, in terms of the emergency food assistance, again, WFP is struggling. Already without all these problems, they are struggling with meeting the needs to provide food assistance. And I think this needs to be looked at also. Again, as I mentioned before, the whole question of funds, the fear that funds from ODA and some of these funds that have been promised would not be forthcoming because of all the financial costs of the war in Ukraine would also affect food security indirectly.
Thank you. My next question then is for Igor. Can Russia be held accountable for provoking such a massive global crisis, which will likely leave millions of people without food and basic supplies? And if so, how? How do we impose accountability on a country like Russia for provoking this crisis?
That's a very interesting question. And it probably opens up a whole lot of discussions again about whether rules-based international order makes, sense at all or not. If we are really going to keep up with it, or we're just taking it for granted and not really paying much attention to all the organizations we already have. And whoever that is, if you weaponize food exports, if you weaponize fertilizers, if you turn a country that exports food for the whole world, and a lot of the wheat from Ukraine goes to Africa, which is a whole continent is in big need of food, then is it not a war crime? I mean, if you bomb seaports, if you and as we've been reminded also by colleague panelists, it will take half a year or even a whole year to neutralize. Even if the war stopped today, it will take us months and even a year to normalize the situation around some seaports. So then is it not a war crime? That's one thing. The other thing is, if yes, how you do that? Is there an organization? Is there an institution in the international order that can handle that? I'm not a lawyer myself, especially not an international lawyer or public international lawyer myself, but ICC sounds like a reasonable institution that could take into discussion something like that. So this is something obviously new for all of us. I mean, for the whole world. War of this kind, bringing such a terrible impact to the global supply chains, as Mikhail was talking about. I mean, this is something that requires the whole international community, being really fair and saying, well, this cannot be done. This is not the way we do it, and whoever is behind it needs to answer. As simple as that.
Thank you. My next question is for Andrei. Andrei, you are a specialist in land policy, land management, land law. How does Russia's destruction of property and land in Ukraine affect the country in the long term? And what kinds of policies or reforms will need to be implemented after the war in order to mitigate these impacts in Ukraine?
Thank you, Milena, for the question. So actually, the direct damage agricultural infrastructure of Ukraine and farmers' assets at present moment exceeds $6 billion. And we also expect that additional economic losses to the industry from the war is expected something like $22 billion, and decrease of the income of Ukrainian agriculture and the related sectors at present moment can be estimated something like from 10 to 30%. My particular concern is also the agricultural lands and forests, where hostiles took place, because over the last few months, the extremely hard work was done by Ukrainian military and pyrotechnicians and dangerous territory with armory, which is polluted with mines, was reduced from 300,000 square kilometers to 185,000 square kilometers, and that's only initial demining. And we understand that we will have this problem for many years to demine the territory and to make it safe for agriculture. Even despite the war, starting from the summer, due to the order of President Zelensky, we have started the development of the recovery plan for Ukraine. And the development is still ongoing, and Mikhail is also the part of the team that working also on the chapter on the new agrarian policy. And to be short, we have the three blocks of policy proposals and 3 blocks of tasks. So the first tasks are for the short term, and actually that includes for this year and maybe the early next year, that's a building a new logistic infrastructure and increasing exports, providing farmers with money for harvesting and sowing campaigns because of the low domestic prices for the grain and other products. They have a crisis of liquidity. And also the third task is to provide the farmers with temporary storage for the 2022 harvest and financing their purchase. The medium-term tasks is for 2023 and 2025 is attracting investments in agricultural sector, in particular in infrastructure, processing, horticulture, and berry growing. The creation of conditions for restoration and development of processing of agricultural products, ensuring demining of territories and land reclamation, and also our task for the trade is the cancellation of tariff quotas for the import of Ukrainian agricultural products to European Union. And in the long term, the main tasks are bioenergy development, support of deep processing of grain and oil crops, opening a new sales market for Ukrainian fruits, livestock, and processed products, and also the development of logistics, river logistics along the Danube River. Of course, Ukrainian government at present moment has limited resources for development programs due to the war, but we hope that with the help of international partners and the improvement of investment climate in agribusiness, we will attract enough investments to implement all those plans. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left, and we have received some excellent questions through the Q&A. So let me take the opportunity to at least address some of these questions. So the first question is as follows. How do we ensure Russia's compliance with the grain export agreements, taking into consideration shellings of ships after the conclusion of this UN agreement? So I wonder if Mikhail or Andrei, or if anybody has thoughts on this.
This is quite different, quite interesting. I've seen the question. I've seen it already, and you know, it's quite difficult to respond positively because the only way how to make Russia being compliant with the grain agreement is actually the enforcement. And the enforcement by by the government of Turkey, which has been one of the major guarantors of security of the grain deal. So they need to play their role. But this is again, this is a temporary solution. The major solution, of course, is the stop of the war and the victory of Ukraine.
Great, thank you. Anybody else have thoughts on this? If not, I'll go to the next
So
question.
maybe I will also
Yes,
just
please.
add a few words. So the grain agreement was signed for 120 days. Yes, and it will be prolonged for the next period if there will be no objections. But at the present moment, as I know, our ministry at least are optimistic about the prolongation of the grain agreement. And we hope that it will work also in the next months. So we will have a supply of Ukrainian grain to the global markets.
Thank you. Now, the next question we talked a little bit about already, but I think it's an important one. So let's return to this for just a minute or two. The question goes as follows. What is crucial for ensuring sustainability of food security in the long-term perspective in this given context of ongoing full-scale war? So when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to ensuring sustainability of food security in the long term, in the face of ongoing conflict, what can or should be done? I know this is a very difficult question, but I do think it's very, very important. Ambassador Stevens, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, as you said, this is a difficult question, because who knows? We don't know how things would advance. We don't know how it could get worse. It could get better. Nobody knows. And the fear is that if it does get worse, in terms of the destruction of agricultural facilities, then we need to think of what next to do.
Thank you. Anybody else have thoughts on this one?
Okay.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So at the present moment, Ukrainian government has few initiatives to make Ukrainian grain export more sustainable, even despite the war and even with the risk of the grain agreement to be cancelled or something like that. So we propose the building of grain terminals on the Ukrainian border with the European countries, which will allow to export at least 2 million additional tons of grain per year. The next initiative we are trying to implement as quick as possible is to build a pipeline for transportation of vegetable oils from Ukraine to European seaport, and we already have such an agreement with Poland, and these preliminary agreements and memorandums was signed last week, and we expect also up to 2 million ton of oil to be exported. And one of the problems which also should be solved is the car transport for grain, and also grain wagons. If there will be an increase for 2,500 wagons in Europe, then that will give an additional possibility to transport up to 10 million tons of grains per year. So we need investments in infrastructure, and that will allow to export Ukrainian agricultural products even despite the war.
Thank you. And Igor, did you have a
Yeah,
thought on this too?
no, definitely. This is a great question and a great issue because, as I said, this whole unfortunate situation, terrible situation, has revealed a lot of vulnerabilities of the global system. Let us not forget that very soon we'll be in 2023, and food security is one of the important elements of the Sustainable Development Agenda, which is to expire in 7 years' time. And I think this has dealt a huge blow to the efforts to, keep the food security problem not to get. But given the fact that it's not only this war, it's also other issues like climate change, which further exacerbates the problem of the food security in the time to come. This all actually calls for something which is more tangible and more structured approach. And I've called for example, for this Global Reserve Food Fund. This might not be the best idea, obviously, but something like that we need to produce as responsible international community. Otherwise, this whole problem is going to get bigger and bigger. And Ambassador Stevens mentioned that some countries may actually start reducing ODA because they want to transfer funds and support the recovery of Ukraine. Don't forget that ODA is already lower than preferred 0.7% of GDP. It's more around 0.3% of GDP. So lowering further actually only further exacerbates the overall global problem we're going to have. So I think the lesson learned with security of food,
at least indirectly answered the two remaining questions in the Q&A. What one had to do with food security and a response to climate change, and you at least indirectly talked about that. And then the other one had to do with more production, which you just mentioned, especially a focus on growing more local foods, which I know some African countries have prioritized in order to combat food insecurity. Yeah. So unfortunately, we are out of time for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for submitting your questions on the PILPG website, as well as shared with all of the attendees via email. Of the PILPG Thought Leadership Ukraine series, I'm deeply grateful to our panelists for taking the time today to talk to us about the war in Ukraine and specifically the impact of the Russian invasion on global food security, as well as to our audience for their engaging questions. Thank you so much and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.